Hello, my name's Johanna Woodcock-Ross and I'm a lecturer in social work here at the University of Kent, and I'm in the School of Social Policy, Sociology and Social Research. I'm very pleased to have been invited here to talk a bit about social work communication and in particular specialist social work communication skills, which has been the subject of my research for about the last 10 years. It's very much a developing conceptual space that I'm in. Quite contentious, but I've recently updated it within a second edition of my book, Specialist Communication Skills for Social Workers, and there it is there. You might think that we know a lot about communication skills, and that perhaps there's been a lot of theory and research on the subject. And certainly there is a burgeoning number of textbooks when you go to the library or in the bookshops. But what there is a frightening lack of research about the reality of communication in practice actions. And commentators have picked up on this and in particular identified that the theoretical underpinnings to communication skills are often implicit, and where they are explicit often lack critical analysis and attention to structural factors. I was really interested in this for two reasons. Firstly, this knowledge gap to practice was really quite worrying. I'm a registered social worker, I have been for 24 years now, and I know how difficult social work practice is, how it's complex, how it's highly emotionally charged, how it's incredibly risk-ridden, but yet we're expected as social workers to find ways to manage that uncertainty. Service users themselves tell us that it's really important that we spend time trying to understand them. And in fact, if we don't spend that time and we are just totally driven by process bureaucratic approaches, we're not going to achieve it. The second issue that interested me related to the fact that the commentary was taking place against a backdrop of modernisation, a political and organisational impetus towards managerialism, to this process-driven practice whereby risk and uncertainty, highly charged nature of practice, could be managed in a particular way with perhaps a checklist process approach. The idea, of course, was to lessen error and therefore the risk to organisations and social work profession itself. Of particular interest was that 3 literature reviews that the commentators drew upon were commissioned by the Social Care Institute of Excellence to provide key messages upon which educators might draw that would isolate, identify and provide some hints for communication skills to be taken up. This idea that communication skills can be identified and isolated in perhaps a supermarket off-the-shelf manner, of course, is around the ideas of behavioural competence. Social work, of course, has had much more of a professional turn, much more emphasis upon the professional relationship as being the vehicle for social work communication. A preference for interpersonal, relational knowing, recognising that we often use more nuanced, more informal sources of knowledge within that communication. This doesn't say we disregard the formal knowledge, but that actually we do draw on both forms. And so government, and particularly the previous Labour government and the previous coalition government, set out a series of reforms to try and increase the skills that social workers will use, these interpersonal skills. And there is within that a very different notion to the supermarket approach that I spoke about earlier, and that is about developing capability. And this diagram here perhaps reflects it in a much more interesting way. The idea that social workers, when they begin their professional career, increase their capability, their capacity to work in a relational way. At different stages, they will have developed particular capability, different levels of capability, increasing all the time as they engage in more complex situations. The more familiar picture to social workers is this one here, particularly obviously in the UK, much more colourful, optimistic version, where we see those levels of capability reflected through the fan. And social workers aspire for each level of capability, moving all the time towards it, seeking, always wanting to improve those skills. But what we also see is that each level of capability reflects 9 domains, and we can see those with those 9 colours. And that any practice action that we're engaged in is a nexus of those domains, several if not all of them at once. The idea of a more integrative, holistic practice, perhaps more usefully understood in this way. And social work students, when they're qualifying, and qualified practitioners in their ongoing work and their annual reviews, are assessed against their practice, against those 9 domains, with those assessors drawing upon multiple sources of evidence to see whether those domains are being all fully employed in the work and in that nexus manner that I was talking about. It's a very significant step away from the traditional checklist approach of behavioural competence that was taken to communication skills, teaching and learning. It's not about behavioural competence, it's not just about one domain of intervention in skills, it actually encompasses them all. For me, in the second edition and the work that I've been doing, it raised 3 key questions. What does this movement away from occupational competence to professional capability mean for the study of communication skills? Is communication now to be conceptualised as communication capacity, the idea of skills being redundant? And if so, how can this embrace the interdependence of several domains of professional capability than just the behavioural manifestation of just one? If the current emphasis within professional development is to develop the qualities and capacities required to work with more risky situations, then social workers must develop the capacity to communicate in a way as to engage fully with those dynamics arising within those risk-ridden situations. If, then, one must follow the other. Authors of the key textbooks of communication skills, however, have long proposed that communication between social work and the service user has certain generic skills, certain skills that are relevant to every setting that the service user and the social worker find themselves. It's really about the degree to which you might use one skill or the other. They've also, however, long proposed that communication is influenced by the context in which it occurs, that the context changes the meaning and the assumptions held by those 2 people in that setting. That is a significant concern because communication is widely understood by those authors to be the conveying of information to achieve a shared understanding which promotes participation of the service user and the well-being of the service user. The idea of sending and receiving information for shared understanding. So this diagram here perhaps reflects those ideas, these generic skills that the authors have spoken about, used in varying degrees. I've illustrated them there. For example, attending, referred to an awful lot, that in any situation we would want to attend to our service user, perhaps using skills of active listening and reflecting back. We will obviously want to challenge service users at times, perhaps they may be holding particular beliefs around their position, which is influencing their well-being and that of their family members. Challenging would be perhaps a particular skill. Of course, that will depend on the particular situation. However, for me, this transferability of skills argument perhaps does not pay enough attention to the different settings of service users. There are particular policies and particular requirements of knowledge for particular settings. And this was particularly borne out by my earlier research, which was undertaken with a colleague of mine, Claire Dragaskis. She's a disability rights researcher. Obviously, I myself am a social work researcher. And we were conducting some research, some analysis of some interviews with parents of disabled children. We were seeking a beginning understanding of an identification of barriers to potential communication between a parent of a disabled child and a social worker. And what we found in this combined analysis was that particular issues for communication arose from that setting, that it affected the processes of communication therefore taking place. It affected the relationship between the social worker and the parent. And often that what was being spoken about was actually related to systemic issues that the parent encountered in their lives. For example, when I looked at the transcripts, I read of the parents talking endlessly and authoritatively, certainly, but with a very much overemphasis upon the development of their child, about how their children were making very clear but small steps in development. But this was often seen in very deficit negative terms by social workers and other professionals involved in their lives. So they felt the need to emphasise the development particularly. When I was reading the transcripts as a social work researcher, I wondered why there was this overemphasis. You know, it was almost at the cost to other aspects of parenting. When a social model of disability understanding was put to it, then I started seeing how that actually reflected the systemic barriers, that actually the child's development was not well understood by the professionals, was not seen in the same terms as those parents, that the parents' private knowledge was not attended to. I wondered whether I might see particular communication issues in other settings that social workers encounter. Could systemic issues and barriers arise in those communication settings, not just in the setting of social work practice with parents? Would that mean that certain strategies for communication had to be employed? So a framework for communication that we could draw upon is the relationship-based approach. It's received a great deal of attention in practice in the last 5 years. The model that I'm drawing on particularly here, and this particular diagram, is drawn from Kate Wilson et al.'s work, and it very much exemplifies the psychodynamic and social constructionist ideas that are inherent in the model. You see the social worker and the service user in a relationship, a reflective relationship, but both are social actors in their social situations. The service user, they're in their social and family environment, but the social worker is also within a situated position of their organisational context. Both, of course, are engaging with each other within a wider socio-political, cultural, economic context. These psychodynamic and social constructionist ideas cause us to think about social work communication as being very much about the use of self and psychodynamic approaches in using self, such as through processes of transference, counter-transference and containment, recognising that service users bring relationship templates to their communication and that those templates get played out in the communication with the social worker. Social constructionist ideas, of course, are around the situated nature of the activity, recognising that social worker is bringing their own assumptions, their culturally prescribed notions of what should take place and understanding. Both of those different ideas mean that communication is more than behavioural manifestation of skill. It's about reflecting on self, about self-awareness. It's about values and attitudes and not just the doing of the job. A second important notion concerns communication obstacles, recognising barriers to communication. The relationship-based approach is not going to be enough in itself to identify those obstacles. It also needs another model, and in the book I talk about using the combined approach of a social model of disability analysis. What that approach will do is really encourage social workers to identify systemic barriers arising in the communication. They should expect these to be communicated about directly, but also indirectly. They should recognise attitudinal barriers that the social worker brings to the communication themselves. And also means that there should be a recognition and validation of private knowledge that the service user brings. When taken together, we have a much more integrative model, recognising both formal and informal knowledge about the way that the social worker is. This is not, again, about practical and behavioural skill. This is about capacity to communicate. It's perhaps best encapsulated using the idea of capability domains. And again, I borrow this a little from Lefebvre. And basically what that's really capturing is that the capacity to address communication arises from those three different domains that I've talked about before: knowing, doing, and being. Knowing being about the knowledge that we draw on, which is both formal and informal, about knowing what to do when and why, for which we may draw on intuition, gut feeling, relational processes that the relationship-based approach promoted, as well as the formal sources of evidence and research that we would want to know about as to what works in situations. It also is about being, the personal attributes that someone has, the use of self, integrating personal and professional knowledge, a preparedness to be self-aware and self-evaluative. And those two things then affect the action that's taken, but also the appraisal of different relevant actions in that moment. Communication, therefore, is how those three things coalesce, and it's about capacity to recognise and address obstacles using those three elements. So what does this mean about a research methodology? How might we achieve that? I'd like to refer to some very briefly and give you a taster of a methodology that I used and which underpins the book. The methodology had to draw on both communication in action, in practice, as well as reflection on it afterwards. And for that, therefore, I was using Schoen's ideas around reflection in and on action, and a kind of flexible application of it has been deemed as acceptable, and it's interesting that it's very rarely actually undertaken in practice. How do I actually do this? Well, for this I used forum theatre. So it's a form of street theatre whereby you have a role play taking place between somebody who is oppressed and somebody who is an oppressor. And a facilitator seeks to engage with both, trying to work out what's going on and encourage an audience to participate and change the action that takes place. I wondered if this would give me the practice-led research that I needed to enable me to look at social work communication in action and on action. The social worker would take the role of the antagonist, in this case the oppressor, although I do take that social workers are meant to be anti-oppressive. I'll explain this in a minute. And the service user would take the role of the protagonist, the person receiving the action, the oppressed. The facilitator would be myself, and what I would be doing is encouraging the audience to stop and start the communication and change it. The idea, of course, is that the audience is so provoked by what they're seeing, so affronted by the oppressive practice, that they would seek to improve it. And in capturing that, I would be able to look at the integrative action that I needed for understanding communication capacity. So scripts were written based on interviews with service users across a number of different settings. Please refer to the book and have a look, but they go right across the age range and in different practice settings, substance use, working with children, young people and so on. And the aim, of course, was to see where there were differences and similarities across those settings. I hope I've given you a taste of the research. The book contains some lively dialogue from those performances and some pointers, and is very much picks up the policy context and the literature around each of the settings, so that you have a real sense of the way in which the context creates some demands for specialist skills. Many thanks.